Welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name is Mark Powell, and I'm the convener for the National Journal of the Presbyterian Church of Australia, AP. And my special guest with me today is Mr. Ashley Saunders, who is also heading up Barnabas Aid. Ashley, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
And great to be with you, Mark.
Now, I always ask every guest this. In some ways, it's sort of a generic question, but I think it's actually the most important question of all, and that is, tell us, how did you become a Christian?
It is a very important question because too often we find our identity in a whole lot of things. And one of my focus in ministry is about the importance of finding your identity in Christ. And so my core identity is that I'm a child of the living God through Jesus Christ, his one and only Son. And I grew up in a home in Newcastle to Christian parents who were and still are members of Mayfield Baptist Church in Newcastle. And I had a godly grandfather. And his influence on my life was just significant. He's a fellow who had served in the Western Front in the trenches in World War I, who was old beyond his years, but he was also a godly man, and he was very important. And I remember, I can't tell you what the preacher was preaching. I just remember we were at church one Sunday night, and what he was saying. I knew, I was 8 years old, and I knew that God, through his Spirit, was calling me to his Son. And my grandfather was sitting next to me. And he died when I was 11, but a really godly man. And even though it's not probably the focus of our conversation, the importance of godly parents and godly grandparents cannot be understated.
Oh, no, it's crucial, isn't it? It's just such a beautiful thing. So tell us a little bit about your journey. Become a Christian, from your own conscious knowledge around 8. How did your life trajectory sort of span out from there?
This might sound really strange, but by the time I was 10, I had 3 ambitions in life. One was to be a dad. I always say that now because when I was pastoring a church in Sydney, and I used to use the word father, and the person who was interviewing me put it up in the newspaper as that I wanted to be a priest. So, yeah, I wanted to be a dad. And that's about the importance of what I've already spoken about, the godly grandfather figure. I wanted to be a lawyer, didn't even know a lawyer, didn't quite know what a lawyer did. We didn't have television, had a very poor upbringing. And so I wasn't really quite sure what a lawyer did. I just knew I wanted to be a lawyer and I wanted to be a politician. And so from that time on, I guess the trajectory was trying to achieve those things. And my life was rocked when at the end of high school I was offered a place to study law at Sydney University, but my parents just could not afford to support me in that, and I thought that was over. And so I enrolled in Newcastle University, just up the road from where we lived, to study mathematics. And I was at the beach and my dad came and said, there's a lawyer in town up the road, wants to meet you with your exam results. And it seems that through somebody at church who knew somebody, this fellow had heard that I existed, and I went and met this fellow, and he offered me a job as a law clerk. So for the next 5 years, I worked full-time as a clerk, studied law by correspondence, and not only then became a solicitor, but bought into the practice just a couple of years later, borrowed more money than I'd ever seen in my entire life. And in that process also got involved in politics, so that I stood for Parliament when I was 20 years of age, for federal Parliament, and was elected to Newcastle Council when I was 26, and then re-elected to council, stood another time for federal Parliament. But my 20s and early 30s was really about law, politics, preaching, family, all those kinds of things.
Wow. So you've had some great ambitions growing up, and you've seen many of them realised. And tell us, what was the process in how you became a pastor?
Yeah, well, that was just something that the Lord kept on putting in the back of my mind. The Sunday school superintendent at our church was a fellow called Milton Morris, a godly politician, still is the longest-serving Minister for Transport that New South Wales has ever had.
Yeah, right.
And he was my mentor in politics and my mentor in preaching. And he formed a lay preachers group. And so from the time I was 19, where there were churches in the Hunter Valley, either without pastors or pastors on holidays or sick, we would fill pulpits. And so from that time, I was preaching several times a year. And it was just always in the back of my mind, is this something the Lord would have me to do? And then when I was in my late 30s, I'd moved to Port Macquarie where I was practicing law as well, and started doing correspondence theological studies, and then in 2001 moved to Sydney to finish those off full time. So it was really, it was a process of discernment. If there's anybody listening who is working through that process, the best advice I got was from my mentor in Port Macquarie, a retired pastor, who said, Ashley, put it off until you just cannot put it off anymore. And that way you will know that this is the Lord's calling on your life, not just something that you want to do. And that was great advice. And I put it off, but it was just compelling that this is where the Lord was leading me.
I think it was Charles Spurgeon, didn't he, that said in lectures to my students, if you can, do anything else.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty hard gig, as you know.
Yeah. Oh, no, look, it definitely, lots of joys, but lots of challenges as well. Okay, so you're now working for Barnabas Aid. Can you explain for everybody listening who may not have heard about it? I know lots of people have. Very briefly, what is Barnabas Aid?
Barnabas Aid is and always has been an aid organisation serving Christians who suffer discrimination or oppression or persecution because of their faith. I guess our strapline is bringing hope to suffering Christians. And that's what we've sought to do for the last 30 plus years. There's lots and lots of Christians who suffer in this world because of their faith. There's lots of hungry Christians because they're cast aside in their society. There are lots of Christians who are being victims of violence, who are ostracised, who, having converted from another religion, having found Christ, are kicked out of their family or kicked out of their business. And we've been in the business, and we are in the business of providing practical and spiritual aid to those of our brothers and sisters.
Where do you find most persecution or hardship is being experienced in the world for Christians?
Yeah, it's mostly in Asia and Africa, parts of Asia and much of Africa. The most dangerous place to be a Christian these days is Africa. It's now the centre of the Islamic State terrorist organisation and their affiliates. And Nigeria is the most dangerous place to be a Christian. And so even though that is in the southwest, a predominantly Christian country, in the northeast, not so much, in the centre, in the middle belt as they call it, a lot of clashes where extremists will come and target Christian villages, and they'll kill Christians, they'll burn churches, they'll burn homes. And this figure I'm going to give you is an astonishing figure, and it amazes me that we don't hear about this in Australia. But across Africa, it is now estimated that some 500 Christians are killed every month. Not every year, not every decade, but 500 Christians estimated to be killed across Africa every month.
Across the whole continent of Africa?
So basically you go across from Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, across through the Congo, Sudan, down into Mozambique. Some of the stories we're hearing out of northern Mozambique are just horrific.
And is it mostly from Islamists?
Yes, it'll be the Islamic extremists. And interestingly, in many of those countries, or some of those countries, they are predominantly Christian. For example, I met when I was in the UK about 6 or 7 years ago, a pastor from Uganda who had converted from Islam. He'd come out of a very staunch Islamic family, and he's got an amazing story about how the Lord reached out to him in dreams, and he came to the Lord, and as a result of that was kicked out of his family. He's now the pastor of a significant church in Uganda, and says that over 30% of the members have come to Christ out of Islam. And so he says something like this. He says, even in a country like Uganda, where there are 80% Christian, only 12% Muslim, within that 12%, there are enough extremists that if you convert from Islam to Christianity, you will be persecuted. He has sustained more than 13 assassination attempts on his life. The most recent one before I met him was about 3 years before I met him, where he'd come out of the church building after preaching, and the extremists called out to Allah and poured a bucket of acid all over his head. And that was just a terrible injury that he sustained, and required 3 years of medical treatment in Uganda and overseas to restore his face, to reshape his lips, to create a tongue, to recover his neck. Just terrible injuries requiring lots of medical treatment. And he said in a video that we made at the time that I met him, he said, all of this is because of my love for Jesus and my conversion from Islam to Christianity. And so he says, even when you think of persecution in, say, the Middle East, even in countries like Uganda, you convert to Christ, you will be persecuted.
So does the government do anything in response, particularly in a majority Christian nation?
It's really hard for governments to have a good response. And there's a sense in which governments are often impotent. So let's go to Nigeria again. Now, and parts of Nigeria, as I've said, are not only predominantly Christian, but very strongly so. But Nigeria, for example, has a power-sharing arrangement where if the president is Muslim, the prime minister is Christian, and vice versa. Right. And so it's unusual for the Islamic leaders to call out the extremists. So
is that a deliberate strategy, is it?
It's intended to be a strategy to maintain peace between the people of different faiths. But in fact, it creates government impotence, because the Islamic leaders are unlikely to call out the extremists in their own community, and the Christians are scared that if we do something, then it'll upset the apple cart politically.
So let's take that as an example or an illustration. How can Barnabas Aid be effective in that situation?
Well, there's a few things. We can be effective on the ground helping those who are impacted by the violence. And one of our key leaders in the international office in the UK is a Nigerian man with plenty of experience, and he is regularly in touch with his contacts on the ground as to what help is needed, how we can help. We've also been involved over the years in advocacy, and Nigeria being a Commonwealth country, it is always hoped that the pressure, for example, that the Commonwealth of Nations brought on South Africa to end apartheid is the sort of pressure that might get a country like Nigeria to address the situation. And when I was preaching at a church in Brisbane during COVID, I met a Nigerian man who was at the university and couldn't get home to Nigeria where his family were. I heard from him only about 6 or 7 weeks ago. And he sent me a text message that said, we don't sleep. We don't sleep with our eyes shut. We're scared that there'll be an attack in the middle of the night to either kill us or to kidnap us. And he said that sometimes the kidnappers, when they call for a ransom, if you pay the ransom, they will sometimes release the people, but sometimes you pay the ransom and they still kill you. One of the things Barnabas Aid does not do and will not do is to pay a ransom. We don't want to be involved in anything that might amount to indirectly funding terrorism or funding the status quo.
So who set up Barnabas Aid? What's its history?
Barnabas Aid was started in the UK a bit over 30 years ago. And interestingly, back in the 70s and part of the 80s, when Patrick Sukadeo, our founder, was involved in trying to raise awareness of what Christians experience, especially in the Muslim majority world, he says that the Christian churches in the UK were not really interested in hearing or not really open to that reality. And again, to understand that, we need to recognise that this was during the Cold War. This was when the big enemy was the USSR, when the big blockage was the Iron Curtain. And it wasn't until the start of the breakdown of the Iron Curtain, and then through the early and mid-90s, the rise of Islamic terrorism, that the world, even the Christian world in Britain, was open to the reality that, yes, there are Christians in Pakistan, there are Christians in other Islamic countries, and they are suffering. And so we officially count our origins as being 1993, so a year and a half ago we had a 30th anniversary, and it's just gone in so many different ways in different countries. So we now have offices in the UK, US, New Zealand, South Africa, Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and a number of others.
Wow. I mean, it's a fascinating situation in the UK because 30 years ago, even the presence of Islam there was minimal, I would have said. But now it's significant. In fact, it's got a Muslim mayor of London. What sort of budget does Barnabas Aid operate out of or from? Can you give an estimate of what your annual budget would be?
Yeah, we've never had budgets as such, in the sense that the desire was always to be faith-led rather than budget-led. But in terms of income, Australia, I think, still ranks in global terms for a Barnabas Aid about number 2 in terms of sources of income. So that in the UK, where it started and where it's got the biggest presence, it would probably have about 12 to 14 million pound revenue a year. In Australia, it's somewhere between $6 and $9 million. So not a small charity, but not monstrous. But one of our distinctives is that we work not only from Christians, so we don't do fundraising in the community generally. We do our awareness of prayer, awareness for funds in the Christian community. So we work from Christians, we work to Christians. Galatians 6:10 is probably our number one scripture, where Paul says, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and we acknowledge that there's many organisations that do that. But we have a special calling on the second part of that verse, where Paul says, especially to those who are members of the family of believers. But in the middle, we work through Christians. So that's one of our distinctives. We don't work with not-for-profits in different countries. We don't send workers into the ground. We work through mainly churches and denominations, but sometimes other Christian organisations in countries. And not only does that provide the aid and the assistance and the support they need, but it also helps to build them up. And it helps to strengthen the church in that area, so that the church is in fact involved in the ministry to its people and to its community.
Yeah, one of the good things I've heard about Barnabas Aid is that the administration costs are quite low, particularly compared to other agencies. Can you tell us a little bit about the philosophy there and what percentage goes directly to the aid project?
Yeah, I can't tell you at the moment what the percentage of overheads is. I can tell you that we keep them as low as possible, and part of that is by not sending Western boots into different countries, but by partnering. So it's a model that minimises overheads. And of course, overheads are important because governance is important and accountability is important and compliance is important. And that all costs money in countries like Australia and other countries. So overheads are important, but it's also important to keep them as low as possible. In terms of one of the other distinctives is that we say and always have said that if somebody gives a donation to a specific project, we don't take any overheads out of that gift. It goes 100% to that project. So, for example, I've been working with Presbyterian Mission over the last couple of years after speaking at the Victorian conference or whatever it's called, and there was some money given for a specific project, and we've guaranteed that 100% of that goes to that project. And so overheads come out of uncommitted general funds.
I mean, I can imagine though, the needs are great. How do you discern the best use of money in those situations?
Part of the model is that we don't create the projects. We work with those projects that are being developed in different countries, that they know what they need, and then we start with the discernment process. And so there is a rigorous process to go through, and so that involves staff members working through, asking lots of questions. It depends, is this an emergency situation or is this something that's a development situation? Is this a natural disaster where funds are desperately needed, where there's a different discernment process? But there is an accountability and discernment process that we go through. Ultimately, through what's called the P&D committee. Doesn't really matter what that stands for. There's an Australian board member who's on that international P&D committee, and the idea there is that after the staff have worked with the people in different countries, have asked different questions, have done different things, then the process gets to this committee who will ultimately determine whether or not this is something to be supported.
Yeah, and I imagine your own role. How much are you visiting and getting around yourself around the world?
I'm overseas about once a year, and it's likely to increase over time, so that it's likely over the next little while that national heads like myself will play more of a role in what you might call the in-country audit process, and that's being developed as we speak. And so I would imagine that would increase in years to come.
I mean, where do you see the threats or the greatest needs going into the next 5 to 10 years? Are you seeing trends or patterns?
Yeah, there are some, and certainly a big focus of ours over the last couple of years has been food. There are plenty of people in the world who are hungry, but I'm talking about those who are hungry because they're poor, and they're poor because they're marginalised, and marginalised simply because they're Christians. And so food has been a significant focus of ours for the last couple of years. At the same time, we really don't want to create dependency, and so yes, it's important to keep people alive, and so those emergency, those basic needs type projects are important, but we also then want to work with the local communities as to what do you need that means that we can help you become more self-sufficient. Interestingly, for next year, how this is talked about and how this is promoted is not yet determined. But let me just think in terms of ham, eggs and chips.
Yep.
That you can help provide some self-sustainability by giving people some pigs, and query whether that might also be a deterrent to the possibility of Islamists attacking.
Yeah.
You can help self-sustainability by giving people some chickens, and not potatoes but computers. And so the idea there is, how can we, over the next year or two, work with these people in these countries as to providing their basic needs to keep them alive, but at the same time going into self-sustainability.
So just on that, so if people want to give particularly to certain projects, they can give to a concrete idea and not just generally as general funds?
Yeah. And like I said before, we guarantee that when it's given to a specific project, 100% goes to that project. That's always been part of our ethos. And so that can be pretty difficult for somebody who's going to our website and using a drop-down box to say which am I going to give to, because there's lots of projects. But if someone is really interested in giving to a project, either a specific country or like Christian widows, there's a widows group in a church in another state, and they regularly give. They've got a heart for helping widows, and so if you're interested in a specific country or area, the best thing to do is to ring the office in Adelaide, and there are 3 ladies there who will take your call and will know what project code to write down, so that the money that someone wants to give goes to that project.
That sounds like a really wise way of doing it, actually, just to talk to someone and say, what are the needs? And I think to prayerfully, even before you call, just to ask the Lord, what would you have me give to? And to guide you as to what you're going to give, and to even start prayerfully considering how much you can give away, and then just find the project in which you can be a blessing to someone, right?
Yeah.
So the people that are taking calls, is that 5 days a week, office hours?
Yeah, 5 days a week office hours, but it is in South Australia, so that means that especially
they're a little bit behind.
No, they're in front of Western Australia. But in terms of summertime, one of the things that most people around the world just do not understand is that in summertime, Australia has 5 time zones.
Oh, I know.
And so if there's an assumption that from a supporter that the office is in Sydney, for example, and they find that it opens at a strange time or closes at a strange time, or even worse, that when it was in Queensland, so 8:30 to 5 South Australian time.
And I take it that you also visit churches and talk about Barnabas Aid?
Yeah, so I probably do that most Sundays. I'm somewhere in Australia speaking in churches, but we also have representatives in each of the states, and we, if there's any congregation member who wants a speaker to come, if there's any pastor or leader who's listening and wants someone to come, again, contact the office and they'll be happy to put you in touch with somebody.
Yeah, because I mean, you've been a pastor. I'm still a pastor. A question I get often asked is, so what do you do all week? And it's a tricky one to answer, because it's like you've got a blank sheet of paper before you and you've got to prayerfully before the Lord. There are some certain things you've got to get done, like sermons and Bible studies and pastoral visits. But what does an average week look like for you? How do you go into your week planning the week ahead?
Well, I first of all look at what events I've got. And so, for example, that might be speaking at a church in Sydney on a Sunday, and it might be having a Tuesday night supporters meeting in Hobart in Tasmania. What flights do you need? So it's a question of what events there are. But there's also, I guess, some internal things. And so one of the goals that I put for us as a staff a couple of years ago was that we wanted to be people of prayer. And so every morning for 15 minutes, the office people in Adelaide and the remote staff around Australia link in and we have some devotions and prayer, and we try to prioritise that whenever we can. There's a staff meeting. There are certain things like when is the magazine going out? We send a magazine out every 2 months, and like any editorial schedule, how do you count back from that as to and it's really really time consuming. Again, a bit like writing a sermon every week. And that is that no sooner does the magazine go to the printer, and you've got to start thinking about the next one.
Yeah.
So there are certain things like that: events, publication schedules, devotions, prayer. But then there's also a lot of teamwork. I want to develop teamwork, and so the remote staff, we meet together once a month. Every one of the state coordinators is to have a prayer meeting for their state, an online prayer meeting. And again, if anybody in any state listening to this wants to get involved, ring the office and they can be put in touch with the relevant state coordinator. So, and again, look, COVID had some good things coming from it, because before COVID, these prayer meetings were local prayer meetings, and you know how difficult it can sometimes be in a regional centre in particular to get people out regularly to pray. Well, now we can do it just online, state by state. And so if anybody wants to get involved in that, please get involved and pray. So we're not just about raising funds. We're actually about raising prayer, raising awareness, and also raising people who are willing to do. And that might be to advocate, to fundraise, to give as the Lord gives them the capacity and the motivation to do that. And so we're about raising all of that, prayer, awareness and doers.
Yeah, great. I mean, you yourself have been a pastor and you've been doing this job for about 6 years.
Yeah.
How did you get into it? How did you know it was time to move out of being a local church leader to actually doing this?
Yeah, again, about discernment. And there was another short ministry I had in between. And so when the role in Queensland I sensed was coming to an end, the pastoring role, I took on the leadership of Australian director of another Christian not-for-profit. And that was only a brief role. But at the end of that, I was pretty much at a loose end. And I was meeting in Adelaide with a fellow I'd met in that role. He headed up evangelical wing of Uniting Churches in South Australia. Okay. And I'd spoken at their conference, and I was just meeting with him to thank him for his fellowship. And he said to me, "What's next for you, Ashley?" I said, "I've got no idea." And he said, "Well, I think I do. I'm the board chairman for Barnabas Australia. We're after a CEO. I think it's you." And so that's directly how it came about. But indirectly, when I was pastoring in Sydney, I found myself for a short time in the Islamic Republic of Iran. That was the first time I'd been in a non-English speaking country, the first time I'd been in a place where Christians suffer for their faith. I then found myself a year later in Western China, and very significantly in 2008 was involved in what's called a peacemaking and trauma healing ministry in South Sulawesi, Indonesia. And there I heard the stories of so many Christians who had suffered badly through the anti-Christian violence at the turn of the century. And some of their stories were harrowing. And so through those three circumstances in particular, the Lord put the suffering church on my heart. But it never occurred to me that I'd ever be directly serving them on a vocational basis.
Yeah, I read a great book recently by Pastor Wang Yi, Faithful Disobedience. He was the pastor of Covenant Rain Presbyterian Church in China. He's now in prison. And he talks about the blessing of persecution as well, which is interesting. How have you seen that in your own experience? I mean, we want to help each other. We don't want to be masochistic and go, oh, it's such pleasure in suffering. But there is a blessing, isn't there, in being found worthy to suffer for the name?
There is in a very godly way. One of the things that I focus on when I'm speaking in churches is really the question, what can we learn in Australia from the suffering church? Because if we think it's all about us praying for them, it's us giving to them, it's all about, in a sense, us being the good guys, but they're our brother and our sister. And so I find there's often a disconnect because our experience is so different to their experience.
Yeah.
And when you ask a suffering Christian, how can I pray for you? If it was in Australia, we'd say, oh, pray that the persecution stops. But the answer we most commonly get is, will you please pray that we will be faithful? And secondly, will you please pray for our persecutors that they might come to know Jesus?
Yeah.
And we can learn about faithfulness from the suffering church. We can learn about perseverance. My experience and my conviction is that I can be very good sometimes at discerning what might be the cultural blind spots in someone else's culture. But we're not very good at finding the blind spots in our own. And when we come across Christians whose main concern is not how much superannuation have I got, whose main concern is not do I have enough money for the mortgage. Now, I'm not minimising those things. Those are very real issues for so many of us here in Australia. But I'm talking here about people who live in a subsistence way, and to actually have a grasp that there are more important things than superannuation or housing. That how can I find my identity in Christ rather than actually getting to the point where I find my identity in my wealth or my identity in my status or in my family?
Yeah. No, look, it's a really good point. I mean, you mentioned Iran and particularly the challenges in Iran. I'd heard recently that there's been a lot of Muslims converting to Christ in Iran. In Iran, has that been your observation?
That's what we're hearing. I haven't been in Iran now for nearly 20 years. That was when I was pastoring in Sydney that I visited there. But even then, the church I visited in Tehran, a church that's now closed down, being closed by the authorities, because they held their church services in the local language Farsi. And if you are an Armenian ethnic Christian, if you are an Assyrian ethnic Christian, there is a degree of toleration in Iran for ethnic Christianity. What there is no toleration for is evangelical Christianity. And so this is a church that, even though the pastor was Armenian, the services were in Farsi, and it was near the university. And it was colloquially known as the Muslim church because so many university students were questioning everything, as university students always have and hopefully always will. And they questioned everything, and they were coming to this church building, and they were hearing about Christ, and they were becoming Christians. And the story that the pastor told us, he'd been held incommunicado by the authorities about a year before our visit. They put pressure on him not to have the service in Farsi, and he said it's not against the law for me to do that. They put pressure on him to only allow people who held a church membership badge to come in. He said it's not against the law, it's open for anybody. And eventually they let him go. But now that church has been closed down because it had its services in the local language, and that's now illegal.
Yeah, wow. Okay, so if people want to support Barnabas Aid, they want to get involved, the best way is to go through the website, have a look first, call the office in South Australia, get the right time zone, and talk to someone?
Yeah, that'd be great. And so the numbers are in the magazines. The numbers are on the website. Call the office, and either Vanessa or Rosie or Anna will take your call, and they'll even offer prayer for you.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, final words. What do you think the church in Australia particularly needs to hear today?
I think the church in Australia needs to hear that Jesus is King, needs to hear that whatever's going on in Australia, we've still got it a whole lot better than so many others, but also to remember that we know how the story ends, to know that there's not just a Genesis, but there's a Revelation, to not live for the here and now. And even in terms of prophecy, there's a sense in which prophecy is, how then should I live today? To live every day and to make the most of it. And it's a pleasure to work with Barnabas Aid as we try to do that. And my encouragement to all Christians in Australia would be, make the most of today, because you don't know how many todays you've got.
Yeah, amen. Amen. Well, thanks so much, Ashley, for joining us. It's been great.
No worries, and thanks for having me, Mark.
Yeah. Well, that's been Ashley Saunders from Barnabas Aid. If you want to find out more information, please visit their website. I hope you've enjoyed this latest edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My name's Mark Powell, and I look forward to seeing you next time.